The chamber fell into an eerie silence as the doors slowly opened. The presence of the ancient being sent a shiver through the room. Admiral Draven stood frozen at the head of the Galactic Council table, his eyes fixed on her. She wasn't like the other delegates. While they wore ceremonial armor and diplomatic garb, she was draped in robes that seemed to shimmer with the very light of the stars. It was as if the fabric itself predated time as the council knew it. Her face was hidden beneath a veil that sparkled with an array of symbols and languages no one recognized. Draven cleared his throat, activating his translator chip. "Honored emissary," he began, his voice steady. "On behalf of the Galactic Council, we welcome you." Her response came not as words but as something far more profound. It was music, a melody that carried emotions, history, and even mathematical equations. It was more than language, it was a deep resonance that seemed to connect with the core of every listener. The translators in the room clicked and sputtered, but none could keep up. Each device failed in turn. Ambassador Torvik, who hailed from the Veldran Collective, clutched his translator with a shocked expression. "What language is that?" he asked, bewildered. "Unknown," came the reply from Dr. Ellen Crane, a linguist stationed at the far end of the room. She quickly tapped away at her console, a look of frustration on her face. The linguistic database contains over 14 million languages, dialects, and communication protocols. But none of them even remotely match this. The ancient diplomat spoke again, her voice rising in what might have been urgency, or perhaps sorrow. Her gestures grew more desperate, as if she was pleading, warning, or telling a story lost to time. Admiral Draven felt cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. This was supposed to be a simple meeting, one that could either solidify an alliance or lead to the end of an era. Her civilization was far older than most, its roots dug deep into a time before most species had even discovered fire. The stakes had never been higher. "Get every translator on this station," Draven ordered sharply. "Linguists, xenolinguists, anthropologists, anyone who specializes in extinct languages. Move now." For the next 3 hours, the station's best minds worked furiously, but the result was always the same, nothing. The delegates from other species stood patiently, repeating fragments of the sounds the diplomat had made, but it was as if the language itself was a locked door with no key. "It's hopeless," Torvik said finally, his voice tinged with frustration. "This language shouldn't exist. She speaks something that defies all known records." Draven's brow furrowed. "Then we will find another way." Without hesitation, he activated the station-wide communication. "This is Admiral Draven. Emergency linguistic request on all channels. Is there anyone who recognizes the language being spoken in Council Chamber 1? The responses came back, each one more discouraging than the last: negative, negative, negative. Then, just as Draven was about to give up, a voice came crackling through on a maintenance frequency. "I do," it said, hesitantly. "I recognize it." Everyone in the chamber turned toward the speaker grid in unison. "Repeat that," Draven demanded, his voice tight with disbelief. "I said I do." "I think I can speak it," came the voice again. It was young, uncertain, but undeniably confident. Dr. Crane's fingers danced across her console. "That signal, it's coming from Docking Bay 7, cargo section." "Bring him here now," Draven ordered, his voice now laced with a new urgency. Joram Kale had never imagined himself in the council chambers. He was just a freight loader, someone who spent his days fixing broken machines, not dealing with the fate of civilizations. But now, he stood at the heart of the Galactic Council, surrounded by beings whose clothing was more expensive than his entire year's salary. His hands trembled, but he couldn't look away from the ancient being before him. "You were the one who contacted us," Draven said, eyeing Joram skeptically. "You claim to know this language." "I don't claim anything, sir," Joram responded, his voice shaky but steadying. "I just know it. I've known it all my life." The room fell into silence, disbelief hanging thick in the air. Torvik shook his head. You're human. This language predates your species. Before anyone could respond, the ancient diplomat moved toward Joram. She glided gracefully, stopping just short of him. Her gaze was piercing, even through the veil, and when she spoke directly to him, the words hit him like a forgotten memory. Joram's expression softened. She says, she greets the last of the scattered children. She thought you were extinct. The room exploded with gasps. Draven stood frozen. Translate every word. Exactly, he demanded, his voice rising. Joram nodded and replied to the diplomat in the same impossible language, his words clumsy, but carrying the meaning just the same. The diplomat's posture shifted as she absorbed the translation. Her form relaxed, as if the weight of centuries had lifted. She responded, her tone softer this time, as if a heavy burden had been momentarily eased. She is the Thesera, Joram said, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. But, she is also something more. She is a keeper. Draven looked confused, his mind racing to keep up. A keeper of what? Her people, Joram continued, his voice steadying. They seeded life across the galaxy before most species had names for the stars. The ancient diplomat's true identity is revealed, and the mystery of her people begins to unfold. But the true reason for her visit is still shrouded in uncertainty. Stay tuned for the next part, where the story takes an unexpected turn. Joram's words hung in the air, their weight palpable. The diplomat's gaze never left him, her eyes now filled with something more than the distant, ancient sorrow they had once carried. Draven stepped forward, his face marked by confusion and curiosity. You said her people seeded life across the galaxy, Draven said slowly. But why have they come to us now? Why seek out humans, of all species? Joram looked back at the diplomat, listening intently as she spoke once more, her voice a melodic blend of sadness and hope. He translated carefully, his hands shaking as he pieced together her words. She says, Joram began, that her people, the Thesera, once spread their knowledge and wisdom across countless worlds. But that was long ago, before many of the species you know today had even evolved. Their civilization was not just advanced, it was timeless. They created beings, like her, to carry their legacy in case their son ever failed. And now, their son is failing. The room fell silent. The enormity of her words seemed to weigh down on every person present, and Draven felt a chill run through him, as if the very concept of a dying star was too much to bear. The idea that an entire civilization, a species older than any of them, could be on the brink of extinction was beyond comprehension. Joram continued, his voice quiet, she says that the Thesera are searching for the wayfarers. The ones who were sent out across the galaxy to preserve the knowledge, the culture, the language. They are the last hope for her people. Admiral Draven looked at the ancient diplomat, his expression hardening with resolve. And you believe this, human, he said, his gaze resting on Joram. You believe he is one of those wayfarers? The diplomat's hand, as delicate as starlight, reached out and touched Joram's face. The gesture was gentle, but the weight of it was enormous, as if this simple touch bridged thousands of years of history and struggle. Joram nodded, his eyes wide with realization. Yes. I never knew. But now. I understand. His voice faltered. I thought my family's traditions were just old memories. Songs, lullabies, words that didn't make sense. But, they were more than that. They were the language. They were the legacy. Draven stared at Joram for a long moment, his mind racing. The human was telling the truth, he could feel it in his bones. But what did this mean for the galaxy? For the Thesera? And for humanity itself? How did you know? Draven asked quietly, his voice full of suspicion. How did you remember this language? Most humans have forgotten, or never knew it at all. Joram's face tightened, his jaw set in a firm line. My family was poor, he said slowly, his voice a little more confident now. We never had much. But we had our traditions. The things that couldn't be bought or sold. The songs my grandmother sang to me. The stories my father told while he worked. I thought they were just words from the past. Nothing more. A low murmur spread through the room as the council members processed Joram's words. It seemed impossible, yet here he stood, a simple dock worker from a forgotten colony, speaking the language that had once been the bridge between the stars. Joram, Torvik interjected, his voice skeptical, this language, this culture, is ancient. It predates even the earliest human records. How could you have kept it alive, when all others have forgotten? Joram turned to Torvik, his expression a mixture of pride and sorrow. It's simple, he said, his voice gaining strength. We never had anything else. We held on to what was important because it was all we had. My people, the poor, the forgotten, we kept the old ways because there was nothing else to distract us. We had no technology, no luxuries. Just our history. And sometimes, that's enough. The diplomat's hands flew to her veil, and she lifted it with a swift motion. As the veil fell away, the room was stunned into silence. The face beneath it was not like any alien they had ever seen. It was human. The same shock echoed through the room, reverberating across every delegate. Admiral Draven's mouth went dry as he stared at the ancient being's features, unmistakably human, yet not. Her face was etched with age and experience, shaped by an environment far different from anything they had ever known. But her eyes, those deep, sorrowful eyes, were undeniably human. Joram's breath caught in his throat. You're human, he whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. She nodded, her eyes filled with a profound sadness that seemed to span the ages. Yes, she said in perfect human standard, her voice now no longer a strange melody but clear and resonant. I learned your language in preparation for rejection. I feared that I would be turned away. But I was wrong. Joram could hardly process what he was hearing. The Thesera, the ancient race that had seeded life across the galaxy, had once been human. It seemed impossible. But why all of this? Joram began. Why the test? Why not just speak to us from the start? The diplomat's expression softened as she answered. Because the Thesera never forgot their legacy. We did not seek your technology or your power. We sought only those who still remembered who they were. The ones who still carry the past with them. Joram stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. It was as if the weight of millennia had settled upon him, the responsibility, the burden, the knowledge that his people were now part of something far bigger than they had ever imagined. The room was filled with a new silence, but this one was different. It was not one of uncertainty. It was a silence filled with understanding. The Thesera had searched for the wayfarers, for those who remembered the old ways. And they had found one in the most unlikely of places, a poor human from a forgotten colony. The revelation of the Thesera's true origins and their desperate plea shakes the room to its core. As the truth begins to unravel, the question remains, what will humanity do with the weight of this legacy? Stay tuned for the next part, where the stakes rise, and Joram faces the challenge of his life. The chamber was still, every eye fixed on the diplomat, who now stood before them as a symbol of an ancient and forgotten past. Joram felt the weight of the moment settle upon him, a burden he hadn't asked for, but one he could no longer ignore. The Thesera had found him, and they had found something more than just a forgotten human. They had found the last thread of a civilization that had once crossed the stars. Draven, his face a mask of disbelief, finally broke the silence. Why didn't you come to us sooner? His voice was sharp, the weight of the situation pushing him to speak before he fully understood it. If you've been searching for this long, why wait until now to speak with us? The Thesera diplomat's gaze softened. We searched for those who remembered, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of regret and hope. But the memory faded. The language was lost, scattered to the winds. Your people, the humans, were meant to preserve it. But most of you forgot. Joram felt a pang of guilt, as though he himself were being blamed for something far larger than he could control. "I didn't remember," he whispered, almost to himself. "I just thought it was, just old words." "No," the diplomat said firmly. "You were born to remember, Joram Kale. Your family kept what others discarded. The rich and powerful may discard the past, but the poor, the forgotten, they hold on to what matters most." Joram swallowed hard, feeling the immense responsibility that was now placed upon him. The Thesera were fading, and the fate of their civilization rested in the hands of a man who had never known his true role in the grand design of the galaxy. Torvik, ever the skeptic, leaned forward, his voice laced with suspicion. "If humans are the key to saving your people, then why haven't they done anything to help?" He looked directly at Draven. "Why haven't the Galactic Council recognized the importance of this?" Draven clenched his fists, his frustration building. "Because we didn't know," he growled. "No one knew. And now we're supposed to drop everything for a people we barely understand." The diplomat spoke again, her voice carrying a sorrow that was almost tangible. "Because your people, and Joram, are the last hope for us. We do not ask for riches or power. We ask for remembrance. The Thesera cannot survive without the legacy of their wayfarers. Without the knowledge of the old languages, we cannot rebuild." The council chamber erupted into a heated debate. Some delegates spoke passionately about the potential political ramifications of aiding the Thesera. Others questioned the authenticity of the diplomat's claims. But in the midst of it all, Joram remained still, caught between two worlds. It wasn't until the diplomat turned to face him again that he realized what he had to do. "You must speak with them," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "You must convince them that the past is not something to be forgotten. It is something to be cherished. The Thesera cannot survive without our history. They cannot move forward without remembering where they came from." Joram felt the weight of her words sink deep into his chest. He looked at Draven, then Torvik, and the other delegates. They were all waiting for him to say something, to act. But how could he? How could he, a poor dock worker, stand in front of the Galactic Council and tell them to help a dying race? "I don't have the power to make them listen," Joram finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just one person. I'm no diplomat. I don't have the authority." "You have something far more important," the diplomat replied, her voice soft but firm. "You have the language. You have the memory of your people. And that is what matters most." Joram looked back at her, and for the first time, he felt the weight of her words fully. The Thesera were not just asking for help, they were asking for humanity to remember its roots. The legacy of the Wayfarers was not just a story lost to time, it was a lifeline. A lifeline that Joram held in the palms of his hands. The room grew quiet as everyone waited for Joram to speak. He took a deep breath, his mind racing with the enormity of what he was about to do. "I don't know if I can convince them," he said, his voice more confident now, "but I'll try. I'll tell them the truth. I'll remind them of what we've forgotten." The diplomat's eyes gleamed with a mixture of gratitude and hope. "That is all we ask," she said. "The rest will follow." As the weight of the moment settled upon him, Joram realized that this was not just about the Thesera anymore. It was about humanity. It was about the legacy they had forgotten, and the legacy they could still save. Draven looked at Joram, his skepticism slowly turning to something else, something like respect. "We'll support you," he said quietly, the words carrying a heavy sense of finality. "We'll help you speak to the council. But you'll need to make them understand. You'll need to show them why it's worth fighting for." Joram nodded, the burden heavy on his shoulders but not unbearable. He wasn't alone in this. The council might be divided, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had a purpose now. And that purpose was bigger than himself. The Thesera were counting on him. The galaxy was counting on him. And Joram Kale was ready to speak for them all. The weight of responsibility is now firmly placed on Joram's shoulders. With the Thesera's survival on the line, will humanity rise to the occasion? Stay tuned for the next part, where Joram must convince the Galactic Council to help a dying civilization. The tension in the council chamber was almost unbearable. The once lively discussions had turned into a cold silence, as the weight of Joram's words hung over everyone. He had agreed to speak on behalf of the Thesera, but now the real challenge was before him. How could he, a simple human, convince the most powerful and influential beings in the galaxy to risk everything for a species on the verge of extinction? Draven had promised to support him, but Joram knew that his influence would only go so far. The council was filled with delegates from dozens of different species, each with their own agendas, biases, and interests. Some would see helping the Thesera as a potential advantage, while others might view it as an unnecessary risk. And then there were those who would simply dismiss the whole idea as nothing more than a fantastical plea from an ancient alien. Joram took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't just speaking for the Thesera anymore. He was speaking for humanity's place in the galaxy. For the forgotten ones, the poor, the neglected, the ones whose history had been abandoned. He was speaking for the past and the future, for those who remembered when others had chosen to forget. Draven stepped forward and activated the comms system. "We will begin the session," he announced, his voice firm and commanding. "Admiral Draven will lead the discussion. We will now hear from Joram Kale." Joram walked to the center of the room, his heart racing. The eyes of the galaxy's most powerful representatives were on him. His hands shook slightly, but he knew there was no turning back now. This was his moment, and he would not waste it. "I stand before you today not as a diplomat, not as a representative of any government or empire," Joram began, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the task at hand. "I stand before you as a simple human, a worker from a forgotten colony, who has lived with nothing but the legacy of a language that should have been lost to time." He paused, looking around at the council members. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and, in some cases, outright dismissal. But Joram didn't look away. He had come this far. He couldn't falter now. "The Thesera were the first to cross the stars," he continued. "They seeded life across this galaxy, before most of you even existed. But they are dying. Their sun is failing, and their people are on the brink of extinction. They need our help." He allowed his words to sink in, watching the reactions of the delegates. Some looked uncomfortable, others appeared moved, but most remained silent, their faces unreadable. Joram took another step forward, the weight of the moment settling even deeper into his chest. "They do not ask for riches or power," he said, his voice growing stronger. "They ask for remembrance. They ask for us to help them rebuild, to preserve what was once lost. And we, humanity, are the last ones who can do it. Not because we have the most ships, not because we have the strongest armies. But because we are the ones who remember." Joram looked directly at Draven. "The Thesera were not just the first to cross the stars. They were the ones who taught us how to walk in the darkness of space. They entrusted us with their knowledge, their language, their legacy. And for generations, we've forgotten. We've chosen to discard what we didn't understand, what we didn't value." His eyes moved across the room, meeting the gaze of each delegate. "But now we have the chance to make things right. To honor the memory of those who came before us. And it's not just for the Thesera. It's for all of us. Because if we let this legacy die, if we let their history fade into nothing, what does that say about us? What does that say about the future we want to build?" A murmur ran through the room. Some of the delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Joram could see the seeds of doubt taking root. The idea of saving an entire species was a massive undertaking, but the idea of saving something as ancient and precious as the Thesera's legacy had a different kind of weight. It was about something bigger than power, bigger than politics. It was about memory. It was about preserving the past so that the future had something to build upon. "The Thesera came here because they believed we could help them," Joram continued. "They believed that somewhere among the stars, the wayfarers, those who still remembered their legacy, would rise up and do what needed to be done. But they couldn't find us. They couldn't find the humans who still held on to the old ways. Until now. He paused again, allowing the silence to fill the room. Then he spoke the words that had been building inside him since this whole journey began. I am one of those wayfarers. My family kept the old language. We kept the traditions, the songs, the stories, because they were all we had. And I am here to tell you that the Thesera's legacy is not lost. It is alive. It is in me. And I know I am not the only one. There are others out there, humans who remember, who still hold on to the past. We can help. We will help. The room was still again. The delegates were no longer looking at him with skepticism. Now, they were looking at him with something else. Something like understanding, or perhaps, something even more powerful, hope. The weight of the moment was not lost on anyone in the chamber. Joram had done what few thought possible, he had brought the ancient legacy of the Thesera into the light. Admiral Draven stepped forward, his voice solemn. We will support you, Joram Kale, he said, his words carrying an undeniable authority. The Galactic Council will help the Thesera. Not because we are compelled, but because we understand. Their legacy is a part of ours now. And we will not let it fade. The diplomat's face softened, her eyes glistening with gratitude. She reached out and placed her hand on Joram's shoulder, a gesture of thanks and respect. Thank you, she said in the ancient language, though Joram understood her words perfectly now. You have given us hope. The council chamber, filled with beings from all corners of the galaxy, stood united in a way that had never been seen before. And in that moment, Joram realized that he had done more than just save a dying species. He had reminded the galaxy of what truly mattered, memory, legacy, and the power of those who are forgotten. Joram's passionate plea has shaken the Galactic Council to its core, and they have agreed to help the Thesera. But the road ahead is not without its challenges. Stay tuned for the next part, where Joram's journey takes a dangerous turn, and the Thesera's fate hangs in the balance. The council session ended, but the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air. Joram stood at the center of the chamber, surrounded by delegates whose faces were now filled with a mix of admiration and uncertainty. They had agreed to help, but the details remained unresolved. The Thesera's survival depended on more than just political will, it depended on action. And action was something the Galactic Council rarely took without weighing the costs. Draven, who had been a silent supporter throughout Joram's speech, stepped forward once more. We will make the formal announcement tomorrow, he said, his voice steady. But for now, we need to focus on the practicalities. The Thesera need a safe place to go. We need to organize a fleet, resources, and support for their people. Joram nodded. He had known that the road ahead would not be easy, but hearing it from Draven, hearing the weight of responsibility in his words, made everything feel real. The Thesera were not just another species to be protected. They were a legacy, a part of history that had been lost and was now being rediscovered. We'll need to find a suitable planet, Draven continued, his eyes scanning the room. A place where the Thesera can rebuild without interference from other factions. It will require careful negotiation, as well as military oversight. We can't risk the political fallout. Joram felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had thought that speaking before the council would be the hardest part, but now it was clear that the true challenge had only just begun. Finding a new home for the Thesera was one thing. Ensuring that they would be allowed to live in peace, that was something entirely different. Have you considered the risks? Torvik spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. If we open our doors to the Thesera, what happens next? How do we prevent other races from taking advantage of their weakness? And what about the factions that may see this as an opportunity for conquest? The Thesera may be ancient, but they are not invincible. The room grew quiet, the weight of Torvik's words hanging over them. It was a valid concern. The Thesera had been the first to seed life across the galaxy, but their power had waned over the millennia. They were no longer the mighty force they once were. But their legacy, their knowledge, that was something worth protecting. And it was something that, if harnessed, could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. Draven turned to Joram, his expression softening. "You heard Torvik," he said. "We need to be cautious. This is not just about giving the Thesera a new home. This is about securing their place in the galaxy. We need to ensure that they're not a target for anyone who sees them as weak or vulnerable." Joram took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The Thesera's fate was not in the hands of politicians or military leaders. It was in his. And for the first time since all of this began, he realized just how much was at stake. The Thesera had given him their trust. They had placed their future in his hands. And now, he had to deliver. "We'll find a way," Joram said, his voice unwavering. "We'll find a place for them, a place where they can rebuild and reclaim their legacy. But we will need the support of the entire galaxy, not just the Council. We need to ensure that every species, every faction, understands the importance of this. The Thesera are not just an ancient species, they are the keepers of knowledge that has been lost to time. If we allow them to disappear, we lose a part of our own history." Draven nodded, clearly impressed by Joram's resolve. "We'll start by speaking to the key factions. The ones who have the power to make a difference. And we'll need to secure a fleet to protect the Thesera during their migration." Joram felt the weight of Draven's words sink in. The diplomatic battles would be hard enough, but the military challenges would be far more difficult. The Thesera were not a peaceful species by nature. They were survivors, and they had been shaped by an existence in the harshest corners of the galaxy. The last thing they needed was to be caught in the crossfire of a galactic conflict. As the council members dispersed, Joram found himself alone with the Thesera diplomat. She had been quiet throughout the meeting, but now she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "You have given us hope," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "But this path is fraught with danger. You are taking on more than you know." Joram met her gaze. "I know. But this isn't just about saving your people. It's about saving the galaxy's history. It's about ensuring that what you've built isn't forgotten." The diplomat nodded slowly. "And you must protect what you remember. The Thesera were once the architects of this galaxy. But now, you must become the guardians of our legacy." Joram felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He was no longer just a dock worker from a forgotten colony. He was a guardian of history, a keeper of a legacy that had been all but erased from the galaxy's memory. And the journey ahead would not be easy. But he knew that he could not back down. Not now. The Thesera diplomat placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "Thank you, Joram Kale. You are the last of the wayfarers. You have reminded us of what is worth preserving." Joram took a deep breath, looking around the chamber one last time. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers both known and unknown. But he was ready. He had no choice but to be. For the Thesera, for humanity, and for the galaxy that had forgotten its past, he would stand strong. The task of securing a future for the Thesera is now in Joram's hands. But with factions and dangers lurking at every turn, the road ahead will be anything but easy. Stay tuned for the next part, where Joram faces political intrigue, military threats, and a race against time. The days following the council session were a blur of meetings, negotiations, and strategy. The support for the Thesera was still fragile, and Joram's role as their advocate had become a constant reminder of the immense weight on his shoulders. The Galactic Council had agreed to assist, but the true power to decide the Thesera's future lay not in their hands, but in the hands of the factions with real influence. Joram had expected resistance, but nothing could have prepared him for the scale of political maneuvering that followed. The galaxy was vast, and every faction had their own interests to protect. Some saw the Thesera's plight as an opportunity to gain influence. Others saw it as a threat, a potential destabilizer in a galaxy already teetering on the edge of conflict. He found himself in an endless cycle of meetings with representatives from dozens of species, each with their own demands. Some wanted a strategic alliance with the Thesera. Others saw the Thesera's ancient technology as a potential weapon to tip the balance of power in their favor. A few delegates, however, remained indifferent, focused only on their own political or military interests. It was in one of these meetings, held in a sleek, metallic chamber surrounded by towering glass walls, that Joram first felt the true pressure of his position. The representative from the Zarnak Alliance, a species known for their cunning and ruthlessness, leaned across the table and smiled with predatory intent. "You understand, of course," the Zarnak delegate said, his voice smooth and calculating, "that any help we offer will come with conditions. The Thesera's legacy, their knowledge, that is a valuable asset. We are willing to lend military support to their relocation, but we expect something in return." Joram felt his pulse quicken. The Zarnak were infamous for their political games, and he knew that any deal with them would come at a cost. "I'm not here to make deals that endanger the Thesera," Joram replied, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his chest. "We're not here to barter away their history." The Zarnak delegate chuckled. "Ah, but history is just another currency in the galaxy, my friend. And the Thesera's history is a treasure. A treasure we would be willing to share, if you agree to the right terms." Joram resisted the urge to shift uncomfortably. He had known the political landscape would be difficult to navigate, but he hadn't anticipated just how far some would go to exploit the situation. The Thesera were not simply a people in need of help, they were a pawn in a much larger game. "We need support, not exploitation," Joram said firmly. "This is about ensuring the Thesera have a place to survive and rebuild. Not about trading away their knowledge to the highest bidder." The Zarnak delegate's smile faded slightly, but he didn't back down. "We understand your position, Joram Kale. But you must understand ours as well. We cannot act without guarantees. And if you cannot secure those guarantees for us, then your mission will fail." Joram's mind raced. He had no intention of allowing the Thesera to fall into the hands of those who would use them as tools of war. But he also knew that the Zarnak had the power to make or break the relocation plan. He was caught in a web of political necessity, forced to negotiate with those who cared little for the Thesera's fate. "I'll speak to the council," Joram said, his voice firm. "But I won't promise you anything. The Thesera's legacy is not for sale." As the meeting came to an end, Joram left the chamber with a heavy heart. The road ahead was becoming more treacherous by the minute. He had thought that securing the Thesera's place in the galaxy would be the hardest part, but now he realized that the political games of the galaxy would be even more dangerous than the threats they were trying to escape. The Zarnak's demand for a dangerous alliance leaves Joram facing tough decisions. The stakes are rising, and the political landscape is shifting. Stay tuned for the next part, where Joram's resolve will be tested as he navigates the complex alliances and dangers that threaten to derail the Thesera's future. Joram's nights had become sleepless affairs, filled with the weight of choices he never expected to make. The council had promised their support for the Thesera, but the promises were fragile, teetering on the edge of political maneuvering, covert deals, and personal agendas. Every day, new complications arose, each one more dangerous than the last. He had just finished another round of meetings when Draven summoned him to the council's central briefing room. The admiral's face was stern, his usually calm demeanor strained. As Joram entered the room, he was met by Draven and a few other high-ranking officials, their faces grim. "Joram," Draven said, his voice tight. "We've received reports. The Zarnak are not the only ones with interests in the Thesera. Several other factions have begun to mobilize, some to offer support, others to take advantage of the situation. There are whispers of covert actions. The entire galaxy sees the Thesera as an opportunity." Joram's stomach sank. He had feared this moment. What had started as a simple effort to help a dying race had now turned into a galactic chess game, with the Thesera caught in the middle. "What do we do?" Joram asked, his voice filled with a quiet desperation. He had no answers. His only concern had always been the Thesera, and now it felt like the entire galaxy was turning against them, with every faction eager to use their legacy for its own gain. Draven exchanged a look with the other officials before speaking again. We're facing a delicate situation. The Zarnak are pushing hard for a military alliance, which could put us at odds with other factions who believe they should control the Thesera's fate. If we don't act soon, the Thesera might be divided, and worse, they could become pawns in a galactic war. Joram's heart pounded. He had known that the Thesera's legacy was valuable, but he hadn't anticipated that their very survival would spark such conflict. Every step forward seemed to bring a new threat. I can't do this alone, Joram said, his voice shaking with the enormity of the task before him. We need the support of those who don't see this as a political game. We need to find allies who will help us without asking for something in return. Draven's eyes softened with understanding. You're right. But in this galaxy, that's a rare thing. We'll need to be strategic. We'll need to reach out to factions that have nothing to gain from this, those who don't have a stake in the power struggle. But it won't be easy. A few hours later, Joram found himself preparing for another meeting, this time with a faction he had heard little about, the Fiori Coalition. Unlike the other factions, the Fiori had a reputation for neutrality, remaining uninvolved in most galactic conflicts. They were known for their humanitarian efforts and had offered aid to species on the brink of extinction in the past. It was a long shot, but it was the best option Joram had. When Joram entered the meeting room, he was surprised to find that the Fiori representative, a tall, slender alien with skin that shimmered like water, was already waiting. She greeted him with a calm, serene smile, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere Joram had grown accustomed to. I've heard of the Thesera, she said, her voice soft yet carrying authority. And I understand your concerns, Joram Kale. I can see the burden you carry. But you must know that the Fiori do not involve ourselves in political games. We help those in need. That is all. Joram didn't hesitate. Then you understand. The Thesera are on the brink of extinction. They need a safe place to rebuild, and I'm asking for your help. Not for political gain, but to help them survive. To protect the legacy of a species that has been lost to time. The Fiori representative studied him carefully, her eyes reflecting a depth of knowledge that seemed to transcend time itself. I believe you, she said after a long pause. But you must understand the gravity of this request. The Thesera are not just a dying species. They are a symbol. Their survival or extinction will send ripples across the galaxy. Many factions will see their survival as a challenge, others as a threat. Joram swallowed hard. That's why we need you. You have the neutrality and influence to help us avoid the political fallout. We can't afford to lose the Thesera, not just for their sake, but for the galaxy's future. We need their knowledge, their legacy, and their guidance. The Fiori representative nodded slowly, a subtle smile touching her lips. You are right. The Thesera's legacy is important. And the Fiori will support you. We will help provide a safe haven for the Thesera, but understand this, you will have to fight for it. You will need to stand firm against those who would use them for their own ends. Joram's heart lifted slightly. He had made progress, but the road ahead was still perilous. The Fiori were offering their support, but he knew that securing the Thesera's future would require more than just political maneuvering. It would require unity, strength, and the willingness to stand against those who sought to exploit the situation for their own gain. As the meeting came to a close, the Fiori representative leaned in slightly, her voice lowering to a near whisper. But remember this, Joram Kale, you are not alone in this fight. The galaxy is filled with those who still believe in the power of memory, the value of history. And if you stand strong, others will come to your side. Joram nodded, a renewed sense of determination filling him. The path ahead was uncertain, and the political landscape was a battlefield in itself. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. The Thesera's future was still in jeopardy, but he had allies now. Allies who believed in something greater than power, the preservation of the past, and the future it could build. With the support of the Fiori coalition, Joram takes the first step towards securing the Thesera's future. But as the galaxy begins to choose sides, the political storm is far from over. Stay tuned for the next part, where Joram faces the harsh reality of war and the price of alliances. The days blurred together as Joram raced against time, navigating the shifting tides of politics and diplomacy. With the support of the Fiori coalition secured, he now had a powerful ally in his quest to protect the Thesera. But the reality of galactic politics was a harsh one. Every decision carried consequences, and every promise came with a price. The Fiori had agreed to help, but their neutrality meant they could not openly confront the more aggressive factions that sought to exploit the Thesera's knowledge. Instead, they would work in the shadows, providing logistical support, safe passage, and protection. But Joram knew that this wasn't enough. The Thesera needed more. They needed a place where they could rebuild, where they could start anew without fear of being torn apart by the political games of the galaxy. Joram found himself back in the council chambers, his face a mask of determination. The room was filled with delegates who had been in heated debates for hours. Tensions were rising, and the Thesera's fate seemed more precarious than ever. There were whispers of other factions, some less benign than the Fiori, making their own moves to stake a claim in the Thesera's future. The Zarnok, who had first attempted to leverage the Thesera's knowledge for military gain, were growing more vocal. They had offered their fleet in exchange for a formal alliance, but Joram knew that such a deal would come at a great cost. The Zarnok were not interested in protecting the Thesera, they were interested in using them as a tool to advance their own power. Joram turned to Draven, who had been his steadfast ally throughout the negotiations. The Admiral's face was etched with concern, and Joram could tell that the pressure was beginning to wear on him. "We can't let the Zarnok have their way," Joram said, his voice low but firm. "They'll take the Thesera, use them as leverage, and then discard them once they've gotten what they want." Draven nodded in agreement. "I know. But we don't have much choice. The Zarnok have the firepower to back up their demands. If we turn them away, we risk a war. And that could destabilize everything we've worked for." Joram clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up inside him. He had thought that the hardest part was over, that convincing the council to support the Thesera would be the biggest challenge. But now, it seemed as though every step forward was met with resistance, every victory tinged with the threat of greater losses. "We can't give in to them," Joram said, his voice growing more passionate. "If we do, we lose everything we've been fighting for. The Thesera deserve better than this." Draven took a deep breath, his eyes hardening with resolve. "I agree. But if we're going to stop the Zarnok, we'll need to find a way to unite the council. We can't win this fight alone. We need the Fiori, we need the neutral factions, and we need the smaller colonies who've been ignored by the larger powers." The plan was simple: unite the neutral factions, rally the smaller colonies, and push back against the Zarnok. But Joram knew that this would be no easy task. The galaxy was a vast, fractured place, and the scars of past conflicts ran deep. The idea of uniting these factions, of convincing them to put aside their differences for the sake of the Thesera, seemed almost impossible. As the council meeting continued, Joram found himself lost in thought. He had come this far, but the next step was going to be the hardest yet. He needed to convince the galaxy that the Thesera were more than just a symbol or a political pawn. They were a living, breathing piece of history, and their survival meant more than just saving one species. It meant saving a legacy that could guide the galaxy toward a better future. It was then that a voice broke through his thoughts, a voice he recognized. "We have to act now." Joram turned to see the Fiori representative entering the room. She was calm, composed, and yet there was an urgency in her eyes that matched the tension in the chamber. "We've been working behind the scenes," she continued, her voice steady. "And we've discovered something troubling. The Zarnok have already begun moving their fleet into position. They're preparing for a military escalation. They're not just seeking an alliance. They're planning to force us into submission. Joram felt his heart race. The threat was no longer distant, it was real, and it was coming fast. Then we have no choice, Joram said, his voice steady despite the rising panic within him. We have to act first. We can't wait for them to make the first move. The Fiori representative nodded, her expression resolute. We're ready to help. But we need your leadership, Joram. We need you to rally the council, to unite the factions. We cannot let the Zarnok win this. Joram looked around the room, his gaze meeting the eyes of the delegates. This was it. The galaxy was on the brink of a new kind of war, one that wasn't fought with weapons alone, but with ideals, alliances, and the will to protect the past. Joram wasn't just fighting for the Thesera anymore. He was fighting for the future of the galaxy, for the memory of a species that had given so much to the stars. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. We'll do it, he said, his voice carrying through the room. We'll unite the council. We'll protect the Thesera's legacy, and we'll stop the Zarnok before they can make their move. Draven placed a hand on his shoulder, his eyes filled with pride. You've got this, Joram. We're with you. Joram nodded, determination hardening within him. He wasn't alone anymore. And together, they would face whatever came next. The political storm is reaching its peak, and Joram must rally the galaxy's factions before the Zarnok can take control. But with the stakes higher than ever, the road ahead is fraught with danger. Stay tuned for the next part, where Joram's resolve will be tested in ways he never imagined. The days that followed were filled with tension, whispers, and frantic preparations. Joram had no illusions about the difficulty of his task. Rallying the factions of the galaxy would be a monumental challenge, especially with the looming threat of the Zarnok. But now, with the Fiori's support and a renewed sense of purpose, Joram felt as if he had the momentum to make a real difference. The first step was to reach out to the smaller, neutral factions, those who had no real stake in the growing conflict but whose support could make all the difference. These were the species who had been sidelined by the larger powers, who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires but had never had the means to shape the course of history themselves. Joram needed to show them that their support for the Thesera would not only protect the past, but also create a future where they could have a voice in the galaxy's future. In a series of strategic meetings, Joram and the Fiori representative spoke to the leaders of the neutral factions, explaining the Thesera's importance and the dangers of allowing them to fall into the hands of the Zarnok. Slowly, Joram saw the first glimmers of hope. A few factions were willing to back their cause. Some out of genuine empathy for the Thesera's plight, and others because they realized the broader implications of the Zarnok's power grab. But not everyone was swayed so easily. Some of the smaller factions were hesitant, afraid to stand up to the more powerful groups, especially the Zarnok. Joram had to be both diplomatic and forceful, showing them that inaction would be far more costly than aligning themselves with the Thesera's cause. It was a delicate balancing act, and he walked a thin line, knowing that one wrong move could lead to the galaxy's fragmentation. As he worked to gather support, the Zarnok continued to escalate their threats. They had begun moving their fleet into position, and their demands grew louder and more insistent. They had no interest in negotiating, only in taking control of the Thesera's future. But Joram wasn't ready to give in. He knew that the Thesera couldn't survive as a political pawn in someone else's game. The galaxy's future depended on their legacy, and that meant they had to be allowed to rebuild, free from the manipulation of power-hungry factions. A pivotal moment came when Joram was called to a final council meeting, one that would determine whether the galaxy would unite in support of the Thesera or fall into the hands of the Zarnok. It was a high-stakes session, filled with representatives from every faction. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Joram knew that the council's decision would shape the future of not just the Thesera, but the entire galaxy. As the meeting began, the Zarnok representative stood, their voice echoing throughout the chamber. "You are all wasting your time," the Zarnok delegate sneered. "The Thesera are a relic of the past. They offer nothing of value. And yet you all waste precious resources and time trying to preserve them. The galaxy needs power, and we are the only ones who can bring that power. Joram's heart raced. He knew the Zarnak's words were part of their strategy, to sow doubt, to make the council question whether the Thesera were worth protecting. But Joram had come prepared. He had gathered the support of the neutral factions, and he was ready to speak with the clarity and conviction the galaxy needed to hear. Standing tall, Joram addressed the council, his voice unwavering. The Thesera are more than just a species. They are the architects of our galaxy's history. They seeded life across these stars long before any of us even knew how to navigate the void. Their legacy is not something to discard. It is something to protect. Because without it, we lose a part of who we are, a part of what makes this galaxy worth fighting for. His words hung in the air, and for the first time, the delegates began to shift in their seats, their attention fully on him. Joram continued, his words growing more powerful with each passing second. The Zarnak claim that the Thesera are a relic of the past, that they have no place in the future. But the truth is, they are the key to our future. The knowledge they carry, the wisdom, the culture, the history, it's something none of us can afford to lose. The Zarnak may offer power, but what use is power if it erases the past? What use is power if it ignores the legacy of those who came before us? Joram's voice rose with passion, and for the first time in the council's history, the delegates were listening, truly listening. We are not just defending the Thesera, Joram said. We are defending the memory of our galaxy. We are defending the knowledge that connects us all. And we will not let it be stolen by those who only seek to control. There was a long silence after Joram's words. The room was heavy with the weight of what he had just said. The Zarnak delegate glared at him, but the damage had been done. The council was divided, but now, there was a chance. There was a real chance that the galaxy might unite in support of the Thesera. Draven, who had been quietly observing, finally stepped forward. I second Joram Kale's words, he said, his voice strong. The Zarnak's agenda is clear. But our future must be built on something more than power and control. It must be built on memory, on legacy, on respect for those who have shaped this galaxy. The Thesera deserve our protection, and we will not stand by while they are used as pawns in a game of power. The room erupted into debate, but it was clear that the tide was turning. The Zarnak were no longer the only voice in the room. Joram's words had struck a chord, and now, the council was beginning to see that the Thesera were not just an ancient race to be discarded. They were a living, breathing part of the galaxy's story, and they had a right to survive. The battle for the Thesera's survival has reached its climax. With the council divided and the Zarnak's power growing, Joram's resolve will be tested as never before. Stay tuned for the next part, where the galaxy's future will be decided in the face of war, politics, and the fight for legacy. The tension in the council chamber was palpable. After days of debate and heated arguments, the galaxy's fate hung in the balance. Joram stood at the heart of it all, his resolve stronger than ever. The Zarnak, once the most powerful voice in the room, had been pushed to the sidelines. Their demands had been rejected, their threats dismissed. But the battle was far from over. The Thesera's future still depended on one final decision, one that could either unite the galaxy or plunge it into conflict. Joram looked around the room, his heart pounding in his chest. Delegates from every corner of the galaxy had gathered, some with their own agendas, others with genuine concern for the Thesera. The neutral factions had rallied to his side, and with the Fiore coalition's support, the odds were shifting. But the Zarnak were not done. They had played their hand, and now it was time for the council to make its final move. Admiral Draven stood beside him, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. The council had been debating for hours, but Joram knew that this was the moment that would define everything. The fate of the Thesera, and the legacy they carried, would be decided by the votes of those in this room. We are at a crossroads, Draven said, his voice low but firm. The Thesera are the last link to an ancient past. They hold knowledge and wisdom that could change the galaxy. But we must decide how to protect them. Do we allow them to become pawns in a game of power, or do we stand together and ensure that their legacy is preserved? Joram felt the weight of Draven's words sink deep into his chest. The Admiral was right. This wasn't just about saving one species. It was about preserving the very foundation of the galaxy. The Thesera had seeded life across the stars, and their knowledge could guide the galaxy through its darkest times. The question was not whether they deserved to survive, but whether the galaxy was willing to protect them from those who would exploit them for their own gain. The Zarnok representative stood again, his voice filled with a mix of fury and desperation. "You fools," he spat. "You cannot see the truth. The Thesera are weak. They have no place in the future of this galaxy. The power lies with those who are strong, those who can reshape the stars to their will. And if you choose to protect them, you will doom yourselves to extinction." Joram stepped forward, his voice clear and unwavering. "No. It's not about strength. It's about memory. It's about the legacy of those who came before us. The Zarnok may have power, but power without purpose is empty. The Thesera's legacy is not something to be discarded. It is something to be preserved, for the future of all of us." The room fell silent. Every eye was on Joram, and for a moment, he felt the full weight of the galaxy's history pressing down on him. He wasn't just speaking for the Thesera anymore. He was speaking for the entire galaxy, for the future of all the species that had been born under the stars. His words had struck a chord, and now, it was up to the council to decide. Draven turned to the council, his voice steady and commanding. "It's time. We will protect the Thesera's legacy. We will ensure that they have a place to rebuild, free from the control of those who would use them for their own gain." One by one, the delegates began to speak, their voices joining together in a chorus of support for Joram's cause. The neutral factions, the smaller colonies, and even some of the more powerful species began to rally behind the Thesera. The Zarnok's influence had faltered, and the council was beginning to see the truth, that the Thesera's survival was not just about their species, but about the future of the galaxy itself. After what felt like an eternity, Draven called for the final vote. Joram held his breath as the votes were tallied. He had fought so hard for this moment, but even now, he could not be sure of the outcome. The galaxy was filled with factions who had their own interests, their own agendas. But the weight of the past, the memory of those who had come before, seemed to sway the council's decision. The results came in, and the chamber erupted into applause. The majority had voted in favor of protecting the Thesera. The legacy of the ancient species would be preserved, and they would be given a place to rebuild and thrive once more. Joram felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was tempered by the realization that this victory was just the beginning. The Thesera were safe for now, but the challenges ahead would be just as difficult. The galaxy had been divided, and it would take time to heal those rifts. But for the first time, Joram felt that hope was within reach. The Thesera diplomat approached him, her face serene yet filled with gratitude. "You have done it," she said, her voice soft. "You have saved us. You have saved our legacy. The galaxy owes you more than words can express." Joram nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "This is just the beginning. The Thesera's legacy is not just theirs. It's all of ours. And together, we will make sure that it is never forgotten." As Joram looked around the chamber, he saw the faces of those who had chosen to stand with him, the allies, the neutral factions, the smaller colonies, all united in the belief that the past mattered, that history was worth preserving. The battle was not over, but for the first time, Joram felt a sense of peace. The galaxy was changing. And with the Thesera's legacy intact, it was a change that would shape the future for generations to come. Joram had been a simple dock worker, a man from a forgotten colony. But now, he had become something more. A keeper of memory. A guardian of the past. And the galaxy had been forever altered because of it. Let this message ignite your faith, rekindle your hope, and spur you to stand firm on your journey. Thank you for staying with me to the end. If this story stirred your heart, drop a like, share this video with someone who needs it, and hit that subscribe button to catch more content like this. May God's blessings overflow in your life, and I'll see you soon.